is the facilitator, and he will start off. And when we get to the discussion part, if you make a signal using your machine or raise your hand, we'll try to recognize people in order. I guess people, as soon as the recording is available, Gus sends out a link for that, and I post that on the Polanyi Society webpage. So it's perfectly possible if you miss a meeting and want to see something later, you can see the video. And I think the videos, the ones on the Zoom cloud, it's fairly easy to fast forward through, so you don't have to take the whole time. But any other things, Gus, that
No, just a reminder that it's probably best if you mute yourself once Dale gets started, and then unmute yourself when you want to speak, so we don't pick up any background noise.
Okay, well, Dale Cannon, how about we turn it over to you to get us going?
All right. I won't have very much to say to begin to set things off. I want to say a couple things just about this, what Polanyi is doing in this lecture relative to other things he's published. And I have 3 discussion questions. I want to identify each of them before we get started and then go back to the first. The second Duke lecture touches on much of the same ground as does the Tacit Dimension. 4 essays that are compiled in part 3 of Marjorie Green's Knowing and Being, collection of Polanyi essays. And then, of course, parts 1 and part 2 of Personal Knowledge, where Polanyi takes up, at least in certain sections, the nature of tacit knowing. He introduces it there, but he clearly is developing it much more fully in the 60s. And the Duke lecture comes, it was given in 1964. The Tacit Dimension was published in 1964. And the 4 essays compiled in Green's Knowing and Being are 61, 64, 62, and 67. What Polanyi is saying in the Duke lectures is really covers in important respects, the same ground as he does cover in many of these other things, but he formulates it in somewhat different ways at times. And I think the differences in Duke lecture 2 are significant at certain points. And those are some of the things I'd like to have us look at and examine together more closely. My 3 questions are as follows. I'll give you all 3 and then go back to the first. I'm interested in finding out, having us discuss what is Polanyi's point in identifying the ontological aspect of tacit knowing in this lecture. And he identifies it certainly elsewhere too, especially in the Tacit Dimension. But what is Polanyi getting at by way of the ontological aspect of tacit knowing? Second question, and relating to this question, the first question, what does Polanyi mean by his peculiar use of the phrase the structuring of reality that recurs in this lecture and this lecture is called The Structure of Tacit Knowing, but he begins by discussing the structuring of reality. What does he mean by the use of this phrase, the structuring of reality? And third, a little more broadly, what does this lecture on the structure of tacit knowing tell us about how Polanyi succeeds in moving beyond Cartesianism, and specifically subject-object dichotomy, the inner-outer dichotomy, first-person, third-person dichotomy, and so forth? And as well, and perhaps in the same respect, what does it tell us about how he succeeds in moving beyond the Kantian phenomenal noumenal split, the split between what appears to us merely and what is in itself truly real? Many of us have commented, and others have commented, about how Polanyi really moved us beyond these. How does this lecture help them, moving beyond those dichotomies? And what are some of the conceptual innovations, conceptual moves Polanyi makes to get us to understand these matters rightly, as he speaks of, let's say, the use of the inverting spectacles experiment, when finally the person who has on the spectacles, he comes to see things rightly in a way that he doesn't at first. Polanyi wants us to see these matters, or conceive these matters relating to the Cartesianism and Kantianism. He wants us to see them differently than what he believes rightly or correctly. How does what Polanyi is doing in this lecture accomplish that? So those are my three questions, although this last one sort of encompasses maybe say several, but it's generally one. My first question, go back to that. What is the point of Polanyi's emphasis on what he identifies as the ontological aspect of tacit knowing? So it's yours. Ellen, and Jordan, you can go ahead.
It seems to me that this is a further development of the discussion we had last week about metaphysical. He seems to be arguing against the notion that we can't really know reality and there really is no truth out there. So that's what I see about ontological.
Okay, so he's extending that line of thinking. Go ahead, Bill.
I would agree with Ellen. I think that's exactly what he's up to. And you notice he calls this the ontological aspect. There are two aspects of tacit knowing. And you notice in this lecture, he does say that the ontological aspect in some way follows from the relationship of the other three elements that he talks to. And I find that to be an interesting development, especially if you compare it to the kinds of things that he says in the Tacit Dimension 2 years earlier, where what he says there is that the ontological aspect is deduced from the others. The second thing I would say about the ontological aspect is that, of course, by this time, Polanyi has kind of worked out his scheme for talking about levels and their relationship and dual control or marginal control. And all of that seems to me to be really the way in which his ontology unfolds.
I think in many respects that's right. And that's the reading I took of it myself when I worked with the Tacit Dimension. But juxtaposed to the first of the Duke lectures and carrying forward Ellen's point, that this continuation of what he's doing in that first lecture, I don't see the emphasis so much in this lecture yet about how we can learn from tacit knowing the structure, the hierarchical structure of reality. So he does have a couple phrases that indicate that if you know where he's heading otherwise. But it has as much or more to do with how it is tacit knowing, as Polanyi understands it and articulates it, that helps us realize that the process of discovery, kind of knowing process involved in the process of discovery, connects us to reality in its transcendence from us. Mm-hmm. Go ahead. I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself? Gus, can you unmute Duane?
That better?
That's better.
Yeah, could you try that again, Duane? Make your point again.
That better?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Duane appears to be frozen.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Yes? Now everybody else is frozen. I'm sorry.
Try it again, Dwayne. Oh, my.
Can you hear that? Can you hear this?
I can hear your voice now, but it seems to be wanting to go in and out.
This is where I started. Can you hear this one?
Yes.
So all I was asking was if someone can make a clarifying distinction between metaphysics, and here we don't have to be so peculiar to Polanyi's use, although we want to keep that in mind, and ontology. Are they continuous? Are these two different parts of philosophical thinking or philosophical tradition? Is there a different direction being taken in metaphysics versus ontology, or is there an argument between them?
I imagine different people present to this discussion may say a little differently, but though I'm aware of some philosophers who make a very clear distinction between them, Polanyi doesn't. I think he's talking about the same thing.
So ontology is a discussion of being.
Yes. Or
So,
reality.
so in Polanyi, there's a relationship between knowing and being, and it's a structural relationship. So he's putting structuring as structuring a verb.
What was the last word you said?
Is structuring a verb?
Structuring is a verb, yes.
So is his discussion of metaphysics and ontology about the subject as an agent
What it would seem
versus a substance or an organism?
it certainly would seem to be implied in some sense, although there's some ambiguity in the use of the word structuring. That's why my second question, trying to tease out what that ambiguity may be, because it, on the one hand, reality is already structured, as it were. Our knowing doesn't create the structure, but it establishes it for us. It makes it known. It discloses it in Polanyi's understanding.
He talks about science as interesting shape, and yet structuring has to do with taking up shapes and shaping them, or being shaped by them. In it, if you think just as a scientist.
Yeah. Use of the word structuring raises some suspicions among Polanyi critics who want to say he's approaching too close to idealism at this point, where the mind in effect constructs reality. And I don't think he wants to say that, but his language lends itself to that.
So the point has to do something with the distinction between idealism and realism.
It may, yes. I'm not entirely sure that it does, but it certainly, to some ears, it certainly does.
In this lecture, he moves towards the end to making the distinction between the accepted ideal of objectivity or explicit knowledge to the ideal of personal knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So is he working with a different concept of subject by introducing personal?
I think so, and that's why I raised the question. I'm interested in raising the question: how does the conceptual move that Polanyi makes in this, or the conceptual innovations that he comes up with in this lecture, how do they help to transform our understanding of body-mind, subject-object, these kinds of dichotomies? Because he clearly ends up, or would have us end up, in a different place than Descartes and the modern tradition would leave us.
Is it, so an aspect relates to a whole, and maybe what Polanyi is about is he's trying to relate to the whole, and the aspect is a different relation to the whole than being a part of the whole, which has to do with knowing. I don't know. Is it just epistemology really in the end, or is there something more?
He's wanting to make epistemology not doable unless you deal with ontology also.
Right.
Can I
mean,
say
that's
something?
what I see.
If it isn't knowledge of reality.
So if I can just, again, I understand my views might be very simplistic, but what I gathered from this lecture specifically is that he's trying to tell us that explicit modes of knowledge are simply a method for knowledge acquisition, but it's not an ontology that tells us what is real and what is not real. That's kind of where he's trying to introduce the tacit part as an ontology.
And it sounds like are you suggesting he's wanting to make these distinct? I think Polanyi is actually wanting to not conflate them so they we become confused, but he wants to say we really don't have knowledge unless we're connecting with reality. And so if our knowledge, progressive knowledge of hidden things, things unknown about the world, our knowledge connects us with those realities that we know in some respects, but do not in other ones. But they connect them, and as we do that, we are progressively, for us anyway, structuring reality. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that
Can't quite hear you.
there seems to be a parallelism here with the phenomenological movement that's playing out kind of in the background here, where it's our engagement with the world that gives rise to its meanings, and that kind of short circuits the subject-object dichotomy. That is to say, we are involved in the world, and we give meaning. We don't worry about the sort of the ontology of it, because what we're interested in is meanings, and giving meanings to things that we are engaged with and construct in the imaginative acts of personal knowledge. That's the final datum. We can't go beyond that and say, but is it real? I mean, or that becomes a kind of that's a question that can be avoided by the phenomenologists, and I think it can be avoided as well by Polanyi.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the parallelism between Polanyi and the phenomenologists in this regard. But I don't, even though I agree with you in some important respects, but I'm hesitant to say I fully agree with you, because Polanyi seems to not want to fully separate our understanding of the meaning of something to be separate really from its reality. It's a dimension of depth of reality where meaning comes into play. And that's already there in the first lecture. Go ahead, Richard.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of phenomenology lately, so I'm glad you brought this up. And it seems to me that his ontology about the world seems kind of self-evident. In the last lecture, he talked about Copernicus was committed to the reality of something out there, the system. So I just take that as given. But what interested me, and I was reading this lecture, was the ontology of our person as it changes as we indwell things. And he seems to imply that we are tacitly changed in our bodies and in our soul, if you say we have one, by our indwelling things. So when I use a probe, I'm actually being changed as I figure out the world. And a lot of phenomenologists say this kind of same thing, like Levinas talks about we're in a state of war because we want to over-conceptualize things rather than engage people face to face. So Levinas talks about this face-to-face encounter with people that actually changes our personality. Husserl talks about this habitus, how when we practice something or aim ourselves at something, it actually changes who we are so we can see things that are new. And I recently just listened to an article by a woman in Catholic theology and philosophy named Teresa Corey, and she was describing Aquinas and Aristotle, whom Husserl gives some allegiance to. And she says, Aquinas, and this is going a little afield, but Aquinas has this idea of the non-materiality of mind. So when I see something like a snake, my being is actually changed. My ontology is changed. I don't have the concept of a snake like I put in my mind like a coin in a bucket. He says my actual being is changed by my interaction with reality. And there's something really, attractive. So Aquinas comes out and says, the intelligible is my intellecting of it. He says they are one and the same. The mind is not a man steering, this is Aristotle, the mind is not a man steering a boat. The mind is the impression of a stamp on wax. It's silly to talk about a stamp on a wax from a seal as, well, what's more important, the wax or the seal? They're both the same. And so, Aquinas and Aristotle and even Husserl seems to talk about our actual being is ontologically changed by our interaction with reality. And to me, this has a lot to do with like indwelling and tacit knowing. It's we're being changed tacitly so we can figure out things intellectually and rationally. And so anyway, I find this extremely exciting. So
I like what you brought up, Richard, and this connects as well with something that was brought up a few years ago by Phil in an essay, what is it, participative realism? This characterizes Polanyi's realism as essentially a participative realism where the knower not only participates in his knowing and in connecting with and deciphering and uncovering things in the world, but in that sense, it changes us, as you point out. But I think it importantly connects us. We are connected with what it is that we know in the world, in Polanyi's understanding. And we remain connected in important ways. We don't just shrink back into the Cartesian ego. So
I would like to pick up a thread that I think Stephanie was kind of moving toward. In the second Duke lecture, there is Polanyi contrast tacit knowing with explicit logic. And he suggests that most of the discussions about science are kind of very oriented toward a kind of explicitness. And he seems to think of logic in rather formal terms. And of course, tacit knowing he thinks of as not formal. And it appears that this has to do also with indwelling and that sort of thing. But it also seems, of course, at the end of the essay that, of course, Karl Popper comes in for a few licks. Popper's more oriented toward thinking about falsification and deduction, that sort of thing. But I'm really interested in this connection between tacit knowing and logic, which it doesn't seem to me has been explored enough.
I think it's important to bring out, and other people I'm sure would like to say something with regard to this, but I wanted to just mention at this point that couple of the people here in the group, and myself in particular, were students of Bill Poteet. And Poteet's book, Polanyian Meditations, toward a post-critical logic. He is trying to rethink the very nature of logic in Polanyian terms. And in effect, beneath the formalism of formal logic, there's something else going on that is rightly recognized in terms of logic and the foundation of logic, but it is not formalizable. And all that Polanyi himself doesn't develop, but I think it's there to be developed and developed further on the foundation that Poteet has laid.
Can I add to that a philosophical daybook where in a certain section he says we need to rethink everything we've said about the distinction between theory and practice, and he has a couple of good entries in there about theory, which I think would tie into the first lecture where Polanyi insists that a theory is real in science, in nature.
Good to point that out.
By the way, just a little anecdote. I think Gus attached to at least one of the emails with the link in this a snippet from Bill Poteet's interview with Bill Scott. And one of the things that's interesting there, this is kind of fragmentary, but Poteet says he likes the Duke lectures much better than the Tacit Dimension.
Uh-huh. Well, that's partly not just the published result, but the most importantly, what happened in the lectures themselves. And it was more of a convivial order as Polanyi experienced it at Duke than he did at Yale, which lie behind the Tacit Dimension. I want to call your attention in connection with some of the things we were discussing a moment ago to a line on page 21 of the second Duke lecture. And here I'm quoting, he's talking about tacit knowing, and he says, it tells us what it is a knowledge of. Tacit knowing is in fact the sovereign instrument for establishing the existence of comprehensive entities and understanding their structure. In tacit knowing, we have found a means of establishing coherence that clearly bears on reality. So he believes he's sort of established that tacit knowing is, in effect, this answer that connects our knowing with reality. The reality he's talking about in Copernicus and other, and the succession of advances in scientific discoveries. Are there further thoughts about what has been brought out so far, especially with regard to what Polanyi, this ambiguous phrase that Polanyi uses of the structuring of reality that tacit knowing accomplishes?
What would be a synonym or an analogy to the way he's using that base word structure?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking of dynamics, but dynamics aren't in themselves structure. It describes movement or action or force or relationship. I don't know if it's appropriate to bring in Elizabeth Sewell. She wrote her thesis on the
Wayne, we're having trouble hearing
of poetry. She said Smith a lot of thinking of structure into the sense, dynamics, nonlinear dynamics of order and chaos. I don't know.
Alan, I think Alan's next. Alan, you had your hand up?
Not really on this. Thank you.
Okay, Richard did. Richard Ludlow.
Yeah, just a quick point. What Phil mentioned, joining tacit knowledge and logic. I think it's in like logical investigations. Husserl grounds the pre-predicative reality that we're in, the taking the world as a whole. He says we have to take the world as a whole before we can take it as a particular. But he grounds that in like laws of logic, like non-contradiction and the laws of identity. He says that pre-predicative world is grounded in these unprovable but substantial and necessary, laws of logic. So that's a connection to what Phil said. I'll end there.
Okay.
Let me comment again on where I think Dwayne was going, but I couldn't hear. I think when you asked the question, Dale, about what's involved in structuring, that's a very good question. And I think what Dwayne suggested originally is that really this is about agency. It seems to me that Polanyi comes pretty close to saying that to be alive is to be an agent, is to have tacit powers. And we, as we're fairly sophisticated, evolved creatures that also are embedded in culture. And so our agency is kind of manifested in that context. And to be an agent is never to be unembedded. You have to be embedded to be an agent. And that's the kind of way Polanyi sort of weaves together the active component of the person and the context in which any kind of action is tied.
Mm-hmm. I think Richard Allen was about to contribute something. Go ahead. We need you unmuted, Richard. Richard, you're not unmuted yet. There you go.
This may horrify you. I shall be about in a little while to write a chapter on the tacit dimensions of logic. And I regard logic, formal logic, as first of all, practically useless. Don't think that way. And secondly, as riddled with fallacies, one of which is the excluded middle. The answer to most questions is neither yes nor no, but yes but and no but. As for the principle of contradiction, well, take the Antipodes. Parts of Britain and parts of New Zealand are exact antipodes. It is exactly the same distance from the one to the other. They are both west and east of each other. But normally we take west and east to be contrary. Equally, I can give you an example of the fact that what we need in logic is the logic of things, not the logic of sentences. I can give you an example of that. That would be off the subject. But Polanyi himself pointed to, Lewis Carroll's famous article in Mind, what the tortoise said to Achilles, which proved that you cannot include the principle of inference in the inference itself without creating a infinite regress. So the very basis of formal logic is something which is tacit, namely in its use. You can talk about it afterwards, but when you're using it, you cannot talk about it. It's being used. And there are plenty of other examples. I mean, you can produce what look like valid inferences, but they all depend on using a word equivocally. But logic doesn't tell you that. That's a knowledge of the language, English or Spanish or whatever it is. That tells you that this word is not being used in the same way. But logic doesn't tell you that. It is the tacit which rules logic all the way. And the great problem with formal logic is that it depends upon scandal. And it depends upon universals, generalizations. But they are unfounded. We just acknowledge them. We can't prove them. But on the basis of all this syllogisms of scholastic logic, all the for every x n in modern logic, you know, and there is no way out of accepting the fact that we can make valid inductions which cannot be deduced. Formal logic depends upon something which cannot be proven by logic. And it all depends upon tacit belief and tacit trust in our own powers. That may not be quite relevant, but
I think it is, Richard. Though it puts it in a somewhat different way than Tacit in Polanyi Meditations puts it, it really, I think, ends up saying something very similar to what he wants to say.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I want to go back to the opening sentences and a word that you didn't pick up on, which interests me,
Go ahead.
image.
Yeah.
He ascribes this surplus of meaning to the image of the theory. Now, I think then he jumps into modern physics, but before that, he's talking about Copernicus. So Copernicus has this theory, but there's something more basic than the explicit theory, which is an image which contains a surplus of meaning. So then as he traces it through the later folks, they, you know, Copernicus got a lot of things wrong, but the basic image seemed to be something underlying the theory which had a surplus of meaning. And well, I'm interested in this because I know at this point Polanyi is increasingly using terms and titling lectures like the creative imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, he becomes much more interested in imagination as a way of knowing.
Yeah, Polanyi
structuring. Yeah.
talked about he doesn't use that phrase so powerfully, creative imagination, but he speaks of scientific new discoveries as works of the imagination. He uses the imagination, and I'm fascinated to some extent, as you are, with this use of the word image. But it clearly is not an explicit image, I think. It's more on the order of what some people might want to call the vision of the person, the scientist who's coming up with this new understanding of things. And that vision is not entirely articulated in his explicit theory. It goes beyond it. There's something aesthetic, and particularly when he talks about beauty and its connection, and the harmonies, and so forth. So image is a slippery term. It's not something you can pin down.
I'm interested in the connection between images and imagining and meaning and perception and conception. It seems like in the second lecture and many other places, Polanyi does not want to make a sharp distinction between perceiving and conception. And somehow or other, images give rise to further problems formulation and lead to richer unpackings of things. Somehow all of these things are woven together, and Polanyi seems to say, well, there's a certain sense in which, of course, that's the case because there's this tacit knowing. It's not explicit knowing, it's not logic, it's not the way we have thought about all of this since the scientific revolution in the sort of philosophical mainstream, which I guess you could caricature with Descartes.
To underscore that, there are places in this lecture where Polanyi himself quite explicitly, to use his words in a sense, speaks of perception involving a conceptual innovation. If there's something conceptually involved in particularly as our perception changes as we experience it, how we see something, particularly like the use of the inverted glasses or the ones that reverse the left and right. When we arrive at a new rightly seeing things again, going through this process, our concepts have shifted. There's been some innovation going on. And so for Polanyi, yes, to go back to what you're basically saying, the perception can involve conceptual moves that are sort of pre-explicit in some important ways, or pre-predicative, to use Richard's phenomenological language.
Just a point, I think Rain, how do you pronounce your name? Rainy, or had your hand raised, right?
I'm glad you noticed that. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. On the question of image, my interpretation, and I'm curious if others feel the same, is that Polanyi is using image basically in the same way as he uses physiognomy and the Gestalt, that it is the whole that's being reached towards, the whole that is manifest in the indwelling, and in particular, I see the word image as part of his rhetoric, that he switches between sensory modalities. So in one place it's image, which is very visual. In another place it's physiognomy, which has more of a physicalist kind of connotation. And I surmise that that's intentional, that he's not wanting us to fall into a single sensory or single mode understanding, that tacit knowing is highly general.
I like that. Good point.
Look, one of the things that, back on this connection between perception and conception, or the failure to, the refusal to make a sharp distinction between the two. So he sort of pulls them together. Of course, Einstein comes back in the second lecture. He made an appearance in the first lecture because of the connection with Mach, which Polanyi wanted to set straight and say, well, it really wasn't what you think, but that a mathematical notion of reality, or mathematical harmonies, become dominant in physics. Well, but when he comes back in the second lecture, he talks about the kind of conceptual basis that led to that, doesn't he? And this is kind of an interesting play, it seemed to me.
Dale, you asked about other conceptual moves he makes that help us get beyond Cartesianism. I don't think we've talked about the attending from, attending to language that he also introduces here, which is very rich, I think, in that regard. And once you see that, you know, the tacit dimension is sort of undeniable, that you're always attending from in order to attend to. But and then of course he goes back to his anatomy and proximal distal. So he's as Rainey was saying, he's kind of moving around, giving finding ways to talk about this relationship between knowing and being that he's discovered, and finds, you know, various languages to use about it.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's worthwhile bringing that into play. My third question, which specifically I'm asking, how is Polanyi's conceptual moves, how do they help shift him from an importantly post-Cartesian, or transcending the Cartesian dichotomies and the Kantian dichotomies? And in this regard, it's particularly in connection with the from-to structure of tacit knowing, but when he talks about it dynamically, this goes back to something Dwayne said earlier. He has some interesting descriptions of how we convert our experience of particulars or of traces in our body, neural traces, and think how we convert them into something else, or in use of a tool or a probe. We go through a shift, and the actual experience of whatever we are initially experienced gets transformed and projected onto the world. In effect, not projected onto something that doesn't have, but it makes what is in the world accessible to us, transparent to us in a way that it wasn't before. And that kind of shift is clearly, seems to me, working against any kind of dichotomous barrier between mind and world, between where we are as sort of the knower as something distinct from the object. We're in touch with the object. We're indwelling the object. Does anyone have any thoughts about what's going on there conceptually that can help us understand how Polanyi moves decisively beyond the Cartesian dichotomous alternatives and the Kantian ones too?
He brings in something about the exceptional place in the universe of the body.
Yes.
And, you know, if you think about going back to the discussion of Copernicus and Galileo with the movement of bodies, the celestial bodies, maybe, or physics having to do with he, I think what would be by comparison abstractions to the concretions of talking about mind, bodily being in the world. With what it's hard to say what draws him to this place, what draws him to the place that he comes out. Is it science? I mean, is it what he's talking about, the passionate pursuit of truth and upholding beliefs that can be unproven? And do we call that his knowledge? He has gained personal knowledge of this. This is where my capacity to narrate or tell the story is not very well developed or educated. I can follow the lines of his thinking, but I can't make the logical leaps, or at least I can't narrate them very well.
Dwayne,
Point to him.
I think you've got a hold of something very important here, the point you're trying to make. And let me try to paraphrase it a bit. Polanyi
Please.
is not just telling this history of science, or even with an interesting philosophical commentary on it. He's utilizing insights that he's found in the history of scientific discoveries and understanding that to make some important changes, you could say philosophically or culturally, in how we make sense of how we know the world. Okay? And in this sense, Polanyi's philosophy is, and I think it really is something that Polanyans don't talk about enough, that Polanyi is really coming up with a new understanding of things, a new paradigm, a new discovery of the nature of knowing and our relationship to the world, the nature of our being, human beings and bodies and all of that. He's really transforming that, and in important respects, he's convinced that he's come up with something real because of the intimation of manifestations that will go on endlessly. As we really come to understand Polanyi, it's like a scientific discovery, his whole framework, his whole conceptual framework. So there's something really important going on. You could say, not just philosophically, but culturally. And I think this is what, I know Steph and I talked about this some, and I've discovered a little about what she's really trying to get at, what Polanyi means by the shift to a post-critical. I think there's a post-critical paradigm that Polanyi is articulating here that is no less important and transformative than Copernicus' discovery of the sun-centered solar system and what then was built on from that. So
Dale,
appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg.
It strikes me that there's in the next lecture on page 3 of the next lecture, there's a sentence, thus a theory becomes meaningful only if you interiorize it and get to see things in its terms. And it strikes me that someone who is not ready to hear Polanyi in reading this lecture, this second lecture, would probably find it difficult to follow, because in parts of it, I was trying to look at it that way, and parts of it seemed to flow pretty well, but then particularly towards the end, the pieces seemed to be coming at me from different directions, and they didn't necessarily hold together without already accepting Polanyi's assumptions and his way of thinking about the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does to me, certainly. And in a sense, what you're pointing out is it's good for us to not only reflect on how we are making sense of what Polanyi is saying, but try to imagine what it's like for someone who is not at all where Polanyi is at. Comes at Polanyi for the first time, as it were, already with a fairly sophisticated understanding of epistemology and metaphysics and so forth. And how difficult it is for them to make that transition from where they are to where Polanyi is. What does it come to see things rightly?
Yeah. And and my sense is that the first lecture kind of helped one enter into his world to some extent. And the second lecture, I appreciated the fact that it came at the idea of tacit knowing from a different direction than other passages, other written explanations. But then it was just right at the end that it seemed to be falling apart. So, but then I just glanced at the beginning of the third lecture, and perhaps in the third lecture, then he will draw some of those pieces back together to make them make more sense. But which reminds me of something I thought of earlier, that the concept of the lectures at Duke, what made them interesting was the conversations that happened, the fact that they were convivial conversations, and so there was this give and take that was happening. It wasn't as though they were just looking at something that was fixed, but it was a dynamic process.
Yeah.
And that's tacit knowing is a dynamic process.
Good point.
I would like to throw in another Polanyi term that I've been sort of obsessing on now for a long time, because I think it's in some ways a problematic term, but it pops up in this lecture. That term is comprehensive entity. Polanyi wants to talk about comprehensive entity and entities, and what are comprehensive entities? And this is in part a way, I think, to get at some of these issues that Dale's raising about the ontological aspect. But it seems to spill over into other areas too. So I'll just raise that question. There's an interesting, I think on page 14, there's a sentence about comprehensive entities. It says, in the comprehensive entity formed by the two terms of tacit knowing, we know the first term only by relying on our awareness of it for attending to the second, viewed as the center of the comprehensive entity. And he goes on to talk about some comprehensive entities have centers, some comprehensive entities don't have centers. So I just raised that as a general issue about Polanyi's terminology, and that term, of course, has a kind of long history. You can find it used in the Gifford lectures, and then he starts using it all the time in personal knowledge, particularly in the fourth part of personal knowledge. And immediately after that, every time you turn around, he's talking about comprehensive entities.
Phil, his other uses of comprehensive entity seem to me to refer to things out there in the world. Here he's talking about it as two terms of tacit knowing. So which is it? Is it epistemological or ontological?
I think, Gus, in important respects, it's both. And in this lecture, it's both. Most of the time, I see it when he's talking about comprehensive entities, not talking about sort of the comprehensive entity, which is the knower in the stretch from attending from to attending to. He does talk about that in other contexts. He doesn't really talk about that so much in this lecture. But what he's mostly talking about is how it is that we know something like a physiognomy, or in one extended section where he talks about knowing biological forms of life. I mean, these are clearly things in the world and other persons. And what his main point in connection with talking about that is that the things, the subsidiaries that we're relying on and understanding and appreciating and knowing a comprehensive entity beyond ourselves in the world, those particulars are in important respects, maybe even in large part, particular features of that comprehensive entity that are outside us. But they, as we indwell it, we have interiorized them in important respects in order to attend to their focus, which is often, he says, not something concrete, but it has to do with the wholeness of the comprehensive entity that we are understanding. Does anyone else have a thought in relationship to what Phil has raised?
Well, I can say just a couple of other things about comprehensive entities. Marjorie Green says in The Knower and the Known that most of the time when he uses this term in personal knowledge, he's referring to other living beings, of which there are all different sorts, including other human beings, and knowing other human beings is extremely complex. That's not completely true, I don't think. He does use the term more broadly than just to refer to other living beings. He also uses, and I think this is what you're suggesting, Dale, that there's a certain sense in which the knower is a comprehensive entity and is extended him or herself in the process of knowing. That's where it gets confusing to me. And of course, when you read things like personal knowledge, of course, turns out machines are comprehensive entities too, and they have two levels, you know, and there's margins that are left open, and other principles can be put into effect at a higher level of control, and that's all part of it too.
Renee, did you have your hand up a moment ago?
Yeah, thanks. It's Rain.
Great, sorry about
Rain, okay.
That's okay. Yeah, I'm surely less familiar with Polanyi's use of that term more broadly, but I appreciate what you brought up, Gus, about the unique use of it in this second lecture, where it seems to encompass more than just the meaning, than just the gestalt. So when you shared that, Gus, I was kind of thinking that I wonder if he's using comprehensive entity, really the comprehensiveness of it is meant to include the proximal and the distal. That by introducing the from-to relationship, there's a risk of introducing another dualism. So there has to be a comprehensive entity that includes the proximal and is not just, we don't just reify the distal.
That's well said. I think also Polanyi's anticipating what he will then develop in terms of the levels, multiple levels involved in it, the nature of a comprehensive.
I want to suggest that something that I've said often before, and that is the importance of analogical thinking in Polanyi. And so I think what we have in terms of his use of comprehensive entity that are similar to one another in some respects, but different in others.
Richard?
Succeeded in getting to your point. I anticipated there was something, I wonder if it didn't come through.
Richard Moody, part of what you said broke up. Can you say it again?
Sure. I guess people can't hear me. I think it's, let me put it personally. When I read comprehensive entity in Polanyi's text, I think of analogies. I think he uses it to refer to things that are similar in many respects, but then have some real differences. And it seems to me that the attempt to get at a single precise definition of what he means by comprehensive entity is going to fail, because he's thinking analogically, as he does often.
Worthwhile point. Thank you.
I think Richard Allen had his hand up.
Yeah. Yes. There's also the corresponding notion of complex performances,
Yeah.
which have the same structure. One of my favorite ones is going to the shops. You know, the various things I do beforehand, en route, and so on, they're all parts of it. It divides itself. Going to do the weekly shopping divides itself into so many sub actions on the way. What holds them together is the whole intention. The same with the machine. What holds it together is its purpose. Now, the machine is usually not a comprehensive, this is in addition to Polanyi, it's not a comprehensive entity in itself and by itself. It has to fit in with a whole social and technological context. You know, it's an engine, yes, but turn what, pull what, do what. Now, it can have many contexts. You can stick a internal combustion engine into all sorts of things to do it with trains, cars, and so on. There's the wider context as well, which is part of it. It fits into that. So it's the structure of it. The fact that it has parts of phases, if it's an action, which then constitute a whole because of the underlying, if it's personal or product, purpose of it. With animals, it is similar. You've got the whole cat, dog, earthworm even, of which the parts are all coordinated by the actions and by the life and structure of the animal, so that you have to attend from them to the whole. I'll give an example. When we had a cat, I saw it one day sitting, looking like this, up a tree we had in the garden. If I were a behaviorist, I would continue to look at the cat, and I wouldn't know what it was doing, except looking up and looking up. But I'm not a behaviorist. I looked from the cat up to the tree, and I saw a squirrel. Obviously, he had chased it up there and was waiting for it to come down. So I shouted boo, and he ran away. And sometime later, the squirrel saw he was safe and came down. So it's a question of looking from the details, in this case from the cat, to the whole situation. Cat is a comprehensive entity. It's in a certain context. Cat, squirrel, predator, prey. So there are wider dimensions than what, in fact, Polanyi mentions of this. There's more context of things. Every organism needs a suitable ecology in which to live and function. They form networks, subcultures, and so on. All right, I think that's enough.
Yeah, it's an interesting extension of, at least I hear it as an interesting extension of what Richard Moody was saying. Is Polanyi's using the term comprehensive entity or phrase as a metaphor. And here, in a given situation with the cat, there are multiple kinds of overlapping comprehensive entities that may be at work.
Yes, what Richard said to me was an exposition of both similarities and differences between different kinds of comprehensive entities.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we're misled by that term entity because, you know, it translates into thing, and we have this bias about thinking of things as being material objects that we can pick up and carry around, and I don't think he means that at all.
Yeah, I would even say, contrary to what you'd said, Richard Allen, that I would look at a machine as a comprehensive entity, at least from one focus. But then, like you said, its purpose then is provided in its context and its relationship to the person who invented it or is using it. But it can be seen as a comprehensive entity because it is well, no, I see your point, but it's hard for me to make that distinction.
If I may answer, Craig, nice to see you. In itself, it is a comprehensive entity, but it is not fully so. To know what it really is, you have to know what it is for. And this applies even to useless. Take ornaments. They don't do anything. They're there to be looked at. Yes, that comprehensive in a sense that they've got a coherent design, otherwise they'd just be heaps of things, random collections. But they're there, their function is to be an ornament. You see, so those architects who hate ornamentation have got it all wrong. They're not functionless, they have a function, to be there. To be an ornament. Yes, I mean, so it's like the Highlander story who picked up a watch and didn't know what it was. You see, he could see it was a complex thing. It had works, it had things going round and so on. But he had no clue as to what it did. He'd never seen any clock or watch before. Now, this is supposed to be a true story from the 18th century. And it's the same with archaeologists. They're supposed to have a category of ritual object, anything which they do not otherwise know the purpose of and do not know what it is. So they use this as a dump category. So I have been told. That may be a slander on archaeologists. You can see the point. You have to have a bin where you put things that you otherwise don't know what they are. And you don't know what they are because you don't know what they're there to do. My daughter did some digging for over a few years, lots and lots of oyster shells, right in the middle of England, the furthest you can get from the sea. Yeah, we knew what they were for. Bits of tesserae. Yes, you know what they are for, but you don't know just what they are for until you can put them together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. This is where the Gestalt comes in. You only can see what the picture is when you've got a fair number of the bits together. Yeah. So it's both the item in itself or the action in itself. And this is the anti-behaviorist argument. I mean, one man passes a £10 or $20 note to somebody else. There's a dozen things it could be. But simply looking at them, you won't know. Whether he's paying a debt, making a bribe or offering a bribe, whether it's extortion, blackmail, or so on.
So this is reminding me, and I don't know, Phil, does this come up in the later in the Duke lectures? Polanyi with the church key, the beer can opener, and or is that?
That's another article, I think.
Yeah. So he takes it back, and all the experts at Oxford, nobody knew what it was for. The strange object he'd brought back from the States.
Great.
Can I ask this Tiamat? This Tiamat. Oh, he's gone.
Oh,
Oh yes, Tiamat, you're there. Tell them about what I gave to you to prove your point that engineer specifications can tell you what something is. Remember it?
Yeah.
Well,
I do.
can you tell the rest of it what it was?
Uh, the point basically, I think, is very simple. As a machine, you can understand it as a purposeful object. And if you understand it as a simple physical object, then you can see it as a simple and in a non-holistic way, not being a comprehensive entity. But as soon as you call it a machine, you suppose per se that it is a purposeful object, and thereby you will see it as a comprehensive object.
I presented you the specification of something and you didn't know what it was until I told you. It was a little jig. You could probably guess it was a jig. It was a little jig, cut pieces of plastic together to make fencing for my model railway. Yes. But you could, yes, you had to concede my point that you needed to know the actual purpose. Specification. Couldn't tell you what it was. Yeah. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Mark.
I think these examples raise an interesting kind of different sort of way in which we solve the problem of what is this that we've come across. It's not simply indwelling, it's trying it out in different contexts of use, among other things. Maybe looking for similar and different things, not only within that context in which we found it, but maybe completely different ones as well. So it just is an interesting kind of case of how it is that we come to understand something.
Dwayne, you got your head?
Yeah, can I kind of ask a question?
Go ahead.
So, Dale, you've had us focus on our place in a structured, let's just say, reality or universe. The universe maybe be having a hierarchy, but it's a real universe. And we've talked about that place being dynamic because we are structuring, and we talked about agent and person. But there's also something going on which isn't so explicit in moving in Aristotle. We talked about Aristotle and Aquinas and Polanyi as philosophy. There is something that Polanyi wants to say, and the change from the medieval to the modern. There's something that we want to leave behind from Aristotle or not bring forward, and it centers around science. But it seems like there is that we do want to bring forward from Aristotle in terms of philosophy as tradition. And my question is, what about the virtues? Talk about structuring reality and the character or nature of our being agents and our being in the world in nonlinear dynamics in relation to reality. I'm wondering, especially when he, in the second lecture, if you read the 5 points he makes at the end, I mean, this is a very programmatic, philosophical way of putting things that is focusing, and it's not complete and it's not totally explicit and all that. But I'm wondering why, even though he talks about virtual reality or by virtue of something, he doesn't talk about the virtues. And I'm wondering if this question is for me. Help me in terms of narrating the structuring of, or the structure of Tacit reality. What is its story and what does it include? Whose story is it? Where are we going with this story? Where does this story take us? In terms of what we talk about meaning and reality and truth. and their pursuit. And I partly raise that because I think one of the comprehensive entities in play here in our conversation is the lecture. We talked about the Science, Faith, and Society. Those are lectures. We talk about personal knowledge as a book, but it's lectures that have been made into a book. And now we're reading the Duke lectures, and we talked about the Yale lectures and the Wesley lectures. And maybe for me, I don't know how this image comes in, but maybe for me, and the idea of virtue, the habitus or the habiliment, but mostly we're meeting Polanyi as the speaker. And anyway, I don't know if that makes any sense or if you've heard everything I've said. I can't tell.
This is picking up on one aspect of it, but it's at the heart of what you get at, I think, because I find many different things being raised at once in what you said.
Sure.
But if what Polanyi's talking about is tacit knowing involves some kind of agency-driven structuring, a verbal kind of activity, okay? We can ask, in what are the norms governing this structuring, okay?
Okay.
And the question of getting at something correctly, seeing a reality for what it truly is, and not getting it wrong. He talks about it in important respects in one place. They're fallible, these things. So in that sense, we need to avoid the ways we can be mistaken. So it's not directly involved, but we can raise the question, what sort of virtues ought to govern or do govern the structuring of reality?
He mentions beauty, which is a traditional virtue.
Yes.
He mentions judgment, which would bring in a form of judgment, or justice, I mean, which is a virtue. Truth is a virtue.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't really, even though it seems like he's really working on the place of the in our midst and our being in its midst. I mean, you in your writing often list those four things: the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just. And I'm wondering where in the tradition called philosophy as a tradition that connects.
Well,
Out of your reading of Polanyi's.
Polanyi in a variety of places. And it's not wholly unrelated to this.
I think one of the things I would say is that we're reading these Duke lectures, 64, and of course there's a lot of water that's passed under the bridge already, and there's a certain sense in which Polanyi's epistemology and his ontology and his ideas here are all about a way to transform our thinking about thinking and about society. This is all on the road to creating the good society. And in fact, I think the epistemology and the ontology, they all grow out of Michael Polanyi's early work on society, on economics. And he's a liberal political philosopher. And he's very unhappy with the way things went after the First World War. And he develops these categories for thinking about things. He has a lot to say about totalitarianism and what that's done. And he, in some ways, sees the move in the 20th century to totalitarianism as somehow growing out of this scientism, this kind of misrepresentation of science. And ultimately, remember, he also talks a lot about things like moral inversion, which is the kind of mindset that we are apt to have as cultural creatures in the 20th century. So I think the whole question about virtue is very tied up with the whole question of how you reconceive thinking and reconceive what the good society is, which is a place where thought grows.
And where are the orienting standards and ideals, values that should guide us? Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, Phil, and just wanted to add that that it seems like Polanyi is the good faith effort to understand, the good faith effort to approach the truth. I mean, that is one of the highest virtues that he's advocating for, and I believe it's in personal knowledge that he really outlines the societal decay and destruction of a science that's not rooted in a good faith search for the truth.
Yes. And the intellectual path which orients us toward it.
We're out of time. Is that right, Gus?
We've been at it for an hour and a half. Yeah.
Well,
Yes, I say we're coming up on our announced end time, so yeah.
well, next week, the third lecture, and I think John Fennell is going to be our facilitator, and see you again next week.
It's been good.
Thanks, Dale.
Thanks for your participation.
Thank you, Dale.
Thank you.
Bye, all.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you,
Good to see
Dale.
everyone. Thank you.
Good to see
Thank you.
everyone.
And goodbye to everybody.
Take care, Richard.
No. Oh, I wish I could meet some of you again in the flesh, but unless you come to England, I shan't be able to.
At least we have this.